The rain poured heavily that night, tapping against the window like a quiet warning. I stood there, my hands trembling, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I knew this was wrong. I had told myself 1,000 times that this could never happen. And yet, here we were, trapped in a moment neither of us could walk away from. It started so innocently, a conversation that lasted longer than it should have, a glance that lingered too long, a feeling that neither of us dared to name. I tried to push it away, to convince myself that it was nothing, just a fleeting thought. But thoughts like these don't just disappear. They grow, slowly at first, until they become impossible to ignore. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine, silently asking a question I wasn't sure I could answer. Every logical part of me screamed to leave, to turn around and never look back. But my heart? It had already crossed a line I could never erase. The air between us felt electric, thick with something neither of us had the strength to fight anymore. I opened my mouth to say something, to stop this before it went too far. But when his hand brushed against mine, the words never came. A distant sound in the hallway made me jolt back to reality. My breath caught in my throat as I realized where we were, what we were about to do. If anyone found out, everything would fall apart. And yet, as he looked at me with the same unspoken longing, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. I took a step back, my breath uneven as reality came crashing down around me. My mind raced with everything that could go wrong, the consequences of even standing this close to him. But my body refused to move any farther. I could still feel the warmth of his touch lingering on my skin, and it sent a shiver down my spine. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes told a different story. There was something in them, something deep, something I knew I should ignore. But I had seen it before, felt it before, and every time it pulled me in a little more. I had told myself this was harmless, that it was nothing more than a dangerous fantasy, playing tricks on my emotions. But as the nights grew longer and the stolen glances became impossible to avoid, I realized I was lying to myself. It wasn't just a fleeting temptation, it was something much stronger. I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself as if that could shield me from the storm brewing inside me. "We can't do this," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain still hitting the windows. He didn't answer right away, but I could feel him watching me. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "I know." The words should have brought relief, but they didn't. They only made the ache inside me worse. Because even though he said he knew, neither of us moved. Neither of us left. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the thoughts running through my mind, the what-ifs, the regrets that hadn't even happened yet, but already felt inevitable. This wasn't supposed to happen. But then why did it feel like neither of us wanted to stop? I turned toward the window, watching as the rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, blurring the outside world. It was strange how something so simple, raindrops against glass, could feel like a reflection of the storm raging inside me. I needed to leave, to put distance between us before it was too late, but my feet refused to move. He stood just behind me, close enough that I could sense his presence without turning around. The silence between us felt deafening, filled with all the words we weren't saying, the emotions we were trying so hard to suppress. I knew this wasn't right, that every second spent in this moment was a step closer to the edge. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to step away. His voice finally broke the silence, low and careful. "You don't have to say anything. I get it." But that was the problem. He did get it. He understood the struggle, the confusion, the guilt that came with feeling something you weren't supposed to feel, and that only made this harder. I turned to face him, searching his expression for some kind of answer, some kind of reassurance that we weren't making a mistake. But all I saw was the same conflict that I felt, the same war between what was right and what we wanted. The air between us was thick with tension, the weight of our unspoken feelings pressing down on both of us. I wanted to say something that would break the spell, something that would make this easier. But before I could, a loud knock on the door made me jump. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding. He tensed, his gaze flickering toward the sound. Whoever was on the other side of that door had no idea what they had just interrupted. For a moment, we both stood frozen, waiting, listening. The knock came again, more insistent this time. And just like that, reality snapped back into place. Whatever was happening between us had to end. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not yet. The knock on the door came again, louder this time, more impatient. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at him, panic flashing across my face. He didn't move at first, his jaw tightening as if he was debating whether to answer. The weight of what we had almost done still lingered in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I stepped back, my pulse hammering against my ribs. "You should see who it is," I whispered, my voice barely steady. He nodded once, but before he could move, the doorknob rattled. Someone on the other side was testing it, checking if it was locked. My stomach twisted. A sudden fear settled in my chest, an unshakable feeling that whoever was out there wasn't just making a casual visit. He hesitated for a moment longer before finally crossing the room. I watched as he placed his hand on the knob, inhaling sharply before pulling the door open just a crack. A voice, muffled but firm, came from the other side. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tension in them. Whoever it was, they weren't happy. His body stiffened, his grip on the door tightened. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone colder than I'd ever heard it. I took another step back, my mind racing. The rain outside hadn't slowed, and the dim lighting in the hallway cast long shadows across the floor. I strained to hear the reply, but the words were lost under the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then, suddenly, he turned back to look at me, his expression unreadable. "You need to go," he said, his voice tight, urgent. My stomach dropped. "Who is it?" I asked, but he didn't answer. His eyes flicked toward the door again, as if weighing his options before looking back at me. "Please," he said, softer this time. I hesitated. Everything inside me screamed to stay, to demand answers, to figure out what was happening. But something about the way he looked at me, like he was protecting me from something I didn't yet understand, made me take a step back. I grabbed my coat from the chair, my fingers unsteady. He kept his body angled toward the door, blocking my view of whoever was standing outside. Every second felt like it stretched forever, the tension unbearable. As I reached for my purse, I caught one last look at his face. There was something there, something more than just worry. It was fear, real, deep fear, and that terrified me more than anything. I hesitated for only a moment before finally turning toward the back exit. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Whatever was on the other side of that door was about to change everything. I stepped out into the rain, my heart still racing, my mind clouded with confusion. The air was cold, but I barely felt it. I pulled my coat tighter around me, forcing myself to walk, to put distance between myself and whatever was happening behind that door. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't let me go. Something was wrong. I made it halfway down the dimly lit street before my phone buzzed in my pocket. I hesitated before pulling it out, my fingers trembling as I glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. My breath caught. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something, curiosity, fear, or maybe just instinct, made me answer. I pressed the phone to my ear. "Hello?" For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a voice I didn't recognize spoke, low and urgent. "You need to be careful. He's not who you think he is." I stopped walking. The words sent a shiver through me, my grip tightening around the phone. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. But the caller didn't answer. Instead, they hung up. I stood there frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned, looking back toward the building I had just left. The door was still shut, the rain creating a hazy mist around the entrance. A figure was standing near it, partially hidden in the shadows. My stomach twisted. I knew I should leave, that getting involved any further was dangerous, but I also knew I wouldn't be able to walk away without knowing the truth. Taking a deep breath, I stepped back toward the building, staying close to the wall as I approached. The figure near the entrance shifted slightly, and as I got closer, I realized who it was. It wasn't the person who had been at the door. It was my sister. Shock coursed through me. She looked up at the same moment I saw her, and for a split second, something flashed across her face. Guilt, maybe even fear. But then she straightened, her expression hardening. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the door, as if checking to see if anyone was coming out. Then she turned back to me. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight. I swallowed hard, my mind racing with questions. "About what?" She hesitated, her fingers gripping the strap of her purse. "About him." The way she said it made my blood run cold. Something inside me shifted, a sudden realization creeping in. Whatever I thought I knew about him, about this entire situation, was about to change, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the truth. The rain fell harder as my sister stared at me, her expression unreadable. My pulse pounded in my ears, and every instinct screamed that whatever she was about to say would change everything. She took a shaky breath. "You don't know who he really is," she said. "I've been trying to warn you, but you wouldn't listen." Confusion and fear tangled inside me. "What are you talking about?" She glanced toward the building again, her shoulders tense. I followed him. I started digging into his past. There are things about him you don't know, things he never told you. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "That doesn't mean—" "Listen to me," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "He's not who he pretends to be, and the person at the door? That wasn't just some visitor. That was someone looking for him. Someone who has been looking for him for a long time." A chill ran down my spine. I turned back toward the building, suddenly desperate for answers. My feelings, my emotions, had they all been built on lies? Had I let myself fall into something I never truly understood? Before I could move, the door to the building burst open. He stepped out, his eyes immediately locking onto mine. His face was tense, his hands clenched at his sides. Behind him, a shadow moved, another figure stepping into the doorway. I recognized them instantly. It was the person from the phone call. The man's gaze flickered between me and my sister, then back to him. And in that moment, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear. Real, undeniable fear. "You lied to me," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He took a step forward, his expression pleading. "I can explain." But I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it, because deep down I already knew nothing would ever be the same again. The air between us felt heavier than the storm around us. I stared at him, searching for something, an explanation, a reason, anything that could make sense of what I had just learned. But all I saw was a man who had run out of places to hide. The person from the phone call stepped forward, their voice calm but firm. "You need to tell her the truth." His jaw tightened, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe even sorrow. He exhaled sharply and looked at me. "I never meant for this to happen," he said. "I didn't want to hurt you." I felt my sister shift beside me, her arms crossed tightly, as if bracing for whatever was coming next. "Then why did you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. For the first time since this all began, he looked truly vulnerable. "Because I was trying to protect you." The words hit me like a wave, but they didn't bring relief, only more confusion. "Protect me from what?" The stranger stepped forward again, their expression unreadable. "From the truth about him." And then it all fell into place. The late-night disappearances, the unanswered questions, the sense that something was always just out of reach. He had been hiding something, something big. And now, It was too late to turn back. I felt a lump form in my throat as I took a slow step away from him. "I don't even know who you are." He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He knew as well as I did. There was nothing left to say. The rain continued to pour as I turned away, my heart heavy but certain. Some stories don't have perfect endings. Some leave scars that never fully fade. But one thing was clear. This chapter of my life was over, and I was finally ready to walk away.